Hi people, so just a quick disclaimer here before getting to this. I will be talking about some sensitive issues. I will be talking about suicide. I'll just say it, so you know if that's something that you think might affect you, then maybe don't watch further. I'm not going to show any graphic images or anything like that, but just the subject matter is, I think, very important, but just giving a heads up there that it's a sensitive issue. Um, I watched this movie the other day, not yesterday, I think it was the day before, The Iron Claw with Zac Efron. I saw it in the cinema and I thought it was a very powerful film. If you're not familiar with it, basically it's a biopic, a sports drama about a wrestling family from Texas, Von Erichs. If you are into wrestling in any way, it's a very strong chance you'll be familiar with this family. Um, Only a few of them sort of made it into the, I guess, the mainstream circuit. Um, but it was the days of the territories, i.e., before the WWE, when the United States was divided into territories. And the Von Erichs were part of one of the big Texas territories. I think Texas was divided into two territories, if I've got that right, which were basically kind of regional wrestling organizations. And the film is about, but that's the signature move that they had. But the film is a very powerful film. It covers the story of these brothers as they get the varying success in the wrestling ring and the effect that has on them. Um, the family is famous for having a lot of tragedy. Fritz von Erich, the patriarch of the family, um, saw five of his sons predecease him. One of them, who's featured briefly in the film, died as a child, and four sons ended up dying before their time, um, free by suicide. And actually, if you're familiar with the Von Erich story, there is still some uncertainty around the death of David Von Erich in 1984. He died in a hotel room in Tokyo. Um, but after that, in 1987, I'm just going to give a brief rundown here. Mike Von Erich took his own life. He was not really a natural wrestler in the way that some of his brothers were. And, it is important that any film is not taken as absolute gospel truth. There will be some artistic license. But Mike Von Erich was foremost a musician. That was his passion. But he ended up in the wrestling ring and he took his own life in 1987. 1991, Chris Von Erich, who I think was the youngest of the brothers, took his own life. And then 2 years later, Kerry Von Erich, 1993, he took his own life in a very similar way. Kerry Von Erich, in some ways, was the most athletic of the brothers. I mean, if you sort of were to draw a 1980s wrestler, it would be Kerry Von Erich. But all these guys were very young, in their 20s, and I mean, Kerry was the oldest, but he was only 33 when he died. The others were just in their early 20s. Anyway, the film stars Zac Efron in the lead roles Kevin Von Erich, who was the oldest of the brothers, or rather the second oldest, after the young boy who died back in the 50s. But he was the oldest of those who grew into adulthood. And I mean, he was such a strong person because he saw so much tragedy in his family. As he put it, he basically lost a brother every year for 2 years over a period of about a decade between 1984 and 1993. And I was watching a question and answer session after the movie. It's on the extras. He said, you could look at it as I've had a lot of tragedy, but you could look at it another way as well. And the thing about the movie, it's definitely, a sad film at certain points, but I mean, I'm not just doing this, by the way, as a review of the film. I'm kind of broadening it out a little bit. Um, you could also look at it as Kevin Von Erich has went on to have a large family. His children have had successful wrestling careers, and in a way, he has broken that cycle. I understand there were times when he lost his brothers, he was feeling suicidal, but somehow he broke that cycle and he went on. He personally doesn't believe in a Von Erich curse, but I think a lot of people looking in would say that's a lot of pain for one family. And there was even tragedies that weren't featured in the film. I mean, a bit of a controversy was the death of Chris Von Erich. Chris wasn't even featured in the film. Now, I understand the rationale of the director, which was that it would have added time to the film and it would have been a bit too much, just one more trauma to take. But I still think it was an oversight. I still think, even just a reference, depicting his funeral or something, just to completely kind of allude to him. I understand that his character is brought into the character of Mike Von Erich, but it just felt like an omission that shouldn't have happened. I should say Lily James stars as Kevin Von Erich's wife. The other brothers, it doesn't really go into their family lives so much, but they all had family lives, of course. But the film's foremost about masculinity, about brotherhood, about all these themes. It's a very powerful film. It's an Oscar-worthy film and a strong performance by the lead actors. But I think it serves as a good talking point for the issues that are indeed here. Um, in recent years, we've heard a lot about the issue of male suicide, how it's a leading cause of death for men between 18 and 60. Actually, there's also a growing problem with suicide for older men as well. This is actually across the board. Um, and the good thing is there is more awareness of this. Um, so that can only be a good thing. There's been some prominent public figures have spoken out about this, about mental health in men. Tyson Fury, Prince Harry. There's been others, that have cited depression, have cited mental health struggles, and brought that up. Um, I guess what I want to raise here is the fact that I have certainly struggled with it. I'm not going to lie, I've struggled with depression periodically, and I'd like to just highlight the fact that it's not an unusual thing. I think I read somewhere that 1 in 4 Britons will go through clinical depression at some point in their adult life. And it affects women as well. It's not just a male issue. It does affect women as well. But for whatever reason, men are more likely to take their own lives. Women do struggle with depression, but men are more likely to take their own lives. Sometimes this has been cited as a toxic masculinity thing. In fact, in the interviews in the making of the film, Lily James cited toxic masculinity, the fact that, these guys were growing up in this wrestling family and I think there has been a lot of criticism of Fritz von Erich. This is to say that if you're familiar with that story, and again, I'm just using this as a sort of citation, as a case study. Many people say he was the Joe Jackson of the wrestling world. He put enormous pressure on his sons. To be fair, though, he passed away himself, so he can't defend himself. Kevin Von Erich has actually defended his father and said the film may give a certain impression. He says he wasn't quite the tyrant that the film makes him out to be. Make of that what you will, but certainly looking at the film, he does seem like a very pushy father, and there are some quite emotive scenes. But Lily James cited this toxic masculinity thing as she interpreted it, this thing about men not talking about their problems. I think there is a problem with that. But there's also a contradiction because often when women talk about toxic masculinity, and I'm not talking here specifically about Lily James, I think she was very good in the role and so on, but I mean more broadly, when we hear this term toxic masculinity, I don't think it's defined very well. I do think there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, and I think it could take various forms. But I will say this, I think there's a bit of a contradiction in saying, oh, we need to encourage men to speak about their problems, while simultaneously feminists will say, oh, we don't need a minister for men. Now, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, look, we care about our brothers and our fathers and our sons, but we don't need a minister for men because the government already deals with men's issues. Well, under that logic, you could say that government departments already deal with women's issues. You know, there's a minister for health, there's a minister for education. In fact, I met her the other day. That's just by the by. I actually happened to meet Bridget Phillipson the other day. She was visiting the local Ukrainian community. She was very supportive of that, you know, so fair play to her. But she's the Minister for Education. She's also the Secretary of State for Women. I'm not opposed to having an office for, you know, dealing with women's issues, but I do think, frankly, there should be a Minister for Men. At least a minister, not even a Secretary of State, just a minister. I don't really buy this argument, oh, but government already deals with that. And, you know, feminists will say, oh, but we live in a patriarchy, so men's issues are already dealt with. Well, clearly, when the male suicide rate is the way it is, then that's a sloppy argument to say that, oh, the government's already dealing with it. You know, if you ask any government minister about this, they'll give a politician's answer. They say, yes, it's an awful thing. We need to address this issue. But I think fundamentally, yeah, I think there should be a minister for men to specifically address, for example, the fact that men are in higher risk jobs, the fact that there are certain pressures on men that perhaps are heavier on men than they are for women. I don't want people to misunderstand what I'm saying with this. Women do face pressures as well. Um, and I'm very cautious about getting into this battle of the sexes. Like, I don't think that helps anyone. I do get quite angry when I hear this nonsense that, you know, frankly, this casual misandry. Because we hear about toxic masculinity, and I do think sometimes men are our own worst enemies. I agree with that. And I'll get into that in a minute. But frankly, when feminists trivialize the very notion of having a minister for men, I mean, I suppose you could argue it's just tokenism. Would it really solve any problems? Maybe not. But the fact that whenever anyone talks about that, they're shouted down by feminists, I think that is quite telling. So my message to feminists is you can't have it both ways. You can't say that you care about men whilst scoffing at the idea of even having a minister for men to address the fact that we do have these problems. I mean, I have nothing against a minister for women. I think that there are issues that women face that men don't face. So I have no problem with that. But why not have a minister for men? Why are feminists so hostile to the very idea of that? And don't give me this nonsense. The government already deals with it. Actually, no, they don't. Not specifically. You know, this argument, men's issues are government issues. Well, you could argue that for women as well. It's I do believe that there should be a minister for women, actually, but I think, okay, let's also have a minister for men. I just don't see why anyone would be hostile to that. On the issue of toxic masculinity, I mentioned that men are sometimes their own worst enemies, and I do think that's true. And I do think there are some bad male role models out there. Well, they're not role models. They're toxic figures. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I would cite someone like Conor McGregor. The guy's a thug. He is everything that young men shouldn't be. He's obnoxious. He's a bully. He treats women like dirt. You know, not only is he unfaithful to his own wife, but his track record of predatory behaviour is appalling. He's a thug. You know, he assaulted an older man who refused to take his signature whiskey. He's just absolutely epitomises what young men should not be aspiring to be. Then you get the likes of the Tate brothers. Again, they are a good example of toxic masculinity. And we've all heard about the rise of the incel culture. It's toxic misogyny online. As a man, it does concern me to some extent. It does concern me that there are young men out there who are being influenced by that. Now, disclaimer, I haven't seen this new dramatization adolescence that a lot of people are talking about. It's got a lot of debate going, and that's probably a good thing. Stephen Graham, I'm not overly familiar with him as an actor. He plays the father in it, but he's got a lot of acclaim for his role. Anyway, as I understand it, it's about a teenage boy who is accused of, I don't know if he's murdered a girl or if it's something very serious. I know he's been involved in a serious crime, and it goes back to the sort of social media he is being influenced by. Certainly, any sort of message that tells young men that women owe them sex or owe them something is a very dangerous message. I will also say this: we live in a culture in the West where there's enormous pressures on both young men and young women. But if people's attitude to, for example, a guy who hasn't had sexual experience is to laugh at him, is to say that he's a loser because he's a virgin, and I'm not talking here about for religious reasons or because he's just conservative in his values. You know, we have to address the elephant in the room. If young men feel alienated, if they feel that they're being ridiculed, they're going to gravitate towards some sort of validation. They're going to gravitate towards sources that kind of validate that anger. So when other men, and it is mostly other men, think that they're being smart arses by saying, oh, this guy's a virgin, it's a particularly disgusting form of bullying, actually, because, the loneliness that causes, and no, for the record, I'm not a virgin. In case anyone's going to jump on the bandwagon, no, I'm not. But I dealt with loneliness. I dealt with that sort of. I wouldn't say I was socially awkward around women. I had female friends, but I did deal with loneliness let's just say later than a lot of other people. So I have some experience of that. Thank God I never gravitated towards those sort of incel communities. But maybe in a different area I might have. That's why I'm concerned about the way young men are being influenced by this. I don't think the answer is just to vilify them or to ridicule them. That is absolutely not the right approach. For sure, they need to be de-radicalized and taken away from that, and they need to be told you cannot blame women for not having success. But there is definitely a toxic masculinity out there. This sort of laddish culture whereby it's not just that. It's not just about ridiculing guys perceived not to have success with women. It's also just this hyper-aggressive, hyper-toxic sort of mindset. I mean, you just have to go into any pub and you see it. You see, that mentality where drinking gets out of hand. Guys have had too many drinks. It gets into fights. I mean, it has to be said, some women are just as bad. You get the toxic ladette culture. That could be just as bad. But there's definitely something out there in our society in which young men just feel that violence is the answer to everything, and it's a very troubling thing. Often social media is blamed for things. I think social media should take some blame, but we can't pretend this just began in the mid-2000s when social media started kicking off. I mean, you could go way back. There's always been a toxic masculinity in, say, football, boxing, where there's idiots who've had too much to drink and they get into fights or they show themselves up, and it's just that's you can't blame social media, for example, on the problem of football hooliganism in the 70s. So I think it's a little bit too easy to blame social media, but I do feel concern impressionable young men being taken in, but stuff. I'm a 39-year-old man. I'm a free thinker. I'm I'm proud of the fact I'm an independent thinker as best as I can be. We're all influenced to an extent, but I can genuinely say I don't follow the crowd. Now, it does concern me that there's young men who feel that they have to prove something. I remember about 10 years ago when I was in amateur boxing, and some young guys asked if I sort of knew them socially at the time, they asked, by young I mean a few years younger than me, they asked if they could come along to the boxing club to sort of part. They said, sure, yeah. I told them about it. And a friend of mine, a female friend, was coming along as well. Actually, wasn't my girlfriend, but one of the young guys actually said to me, is she your, and I quote, is she your bitch? And I'm thinking, yeah, you've been listening to many rap videos. She's my friend, and that's not really a respectful term, just. And I didn't really want to shame the young guy, but I wanted to say, look, don't talk about women like that. It's just, that's why I hate rap. That's why I hate the sort of culture that is embodied in so much rap nowadays. Um, and it's not politically correct to say that because people think, oh, it's like a race thing because it's deemed to be black music. I think that's rubbish. Um, some of them, the artists I respect the most are black. So some of my favourite musicians are black. But I do think, unquestionably, there is a pretty toxic culture in gangster rap. I see absolutely nothing honourable about it. I have no admiration for someone like Tupac Shakur because I just don't think that a thug lifestyle is something to look up to. And that might trigger a few people, it might offend a few people. It has to be said. In the boxing world, a lot of people look up to Mike Tyson. Well, again, Mike Tyson had skills as a boxer. I personally think he's overrated. I prefer to look up to someone like the Klitschko brothers, Alexander Usyk, Manny Pacquiao. People who carry themselves in a much better way um, than the aforementioned heavyweight boxer. I mean, this is not to say that people are perfect. No one's perfect, but I think that there is such a thing as positive masculinity because one mistake that's often made in society is this idea that the opposite of toxic masculinity has to be this kind of passive, almost beta male effeminate type masculinity. Now, my view on that is each to their own. I don't judge guys who are effeminate, as long as they're happy in themselves. But I'm comfortable in my own masculinity. I don't think the opposite of toxic masculinity is. I don't think the alternative is to be kind of totally passive and totally. I think there are male characteristics that are a good thing. I don't think we should necessarily shun that. I mean, people often make the conclusion that toxic masculinity means all masculinity. No, it doesn't. If you have a situation, I want to be careful how I describe this because I don't want people to think I'm making generalizations. But if you have a situation where, well, okay, I'll cite a famous example. United 93. It was the fourth plane hijacked on September 11th. Now, famously in that incident, the passengers fought back. But specifically, there were about 3 or 4 guys on that flight who kind of spearheaded that. And whilst I think all the passengers deserve credit, it was guys like Todd Beamer, Jeremy Glick, um, and there was another guy whose name I don't remember off the top of my head. But they were what many people would term to be alpha males. One of them was a rugby player. They were kind of all American guys, and the point I'm making with this is they courageously fought back. Now who would say that that was toxic masculinity? The point I'm making is there's times that physical bravery, physical prowess, those sort of positive male attributes are very good things. I mean, it's not good, obviously, that everyone on that flight died, but they did. It's widely believed that by doing what they'd done, by standing up to the hijackers, they possibly prevented even more deaths on that awful day, because that plane was destined to fly into the Capitol building. Um, so I don't accept that the opposite of or the alternative to toxic masculinity is no masculinity. I think masculinity can be a very positive thing. There are strong men out there who deserve admiration. Um, I'm just going to finish with a few thoughts. I take issue with with that sort of black and white way of thinking. It's either toxic masculinity or it's no masculinity. No, I don't accept that. I also take issue with casual misandry. That is to say, male shaming. You see it all the time in the press. I mean, there isn't a day goes by where there isn't at least one article taking a swipe at men. And it's important not to overthink this. It's important not to think it's. But I do contend that no male columnist would get away with the sort of casual sweeps on women that some women columnists get away with on men. I do contend there are absolutely double standards out there. And I have very low respect for men who pander to this misandry, who think that they're being smart by kind of engaging in. I've seen these sort of social media posts where there's basically generic sweeps on men, and then some smart arse comes in and says, "Oh, look at all the guys getting triggered." Well, maybe men are fed up with double standards, and understandably they take issue with that. It doesn't mean that they're insecure. I take issue with double standards. Now, I've always called out misogyny, and there are areas that women are affected. I mean, the justice or the lack of justice that female victims of domestic violence and sexual crimes, the lack of justice there is appalling. I think the penalties for violent thugs who beat up their girlfriends and wives is far, far, far too lenient. There are areas that affect women. I think, for example, when we look at sanitary products, women have to pay more. There is areas that women are still struggle, but there are also areas that men struggle, and it's not good enough to say, well, men struggle because of the patriarchy. If you're making kind of a casual sweeping line on men, and that's deemed to be okay, basically this just stop the double standards. Because when young men are hearing this constant shaming, then maybe they will gravitate to more toxic sources. And don't get me wrong, I think it is important to call out. Absolutely, misogyny needs to be called out. But I just don't think it's good to have this constant narrative whereby it's presented as we live in a society of male privilege. That's absolute BS. I mean, look at a few years ago, Will Nolan, the lecturer at Eton College, who gave a lecture about patriarchy talking to young men. This was by no means toxic masculinity. I looked at that lecture. It made some very valid points. Now, he was immediately, by the male principal, forced out, silenced. It was an absolute disgrace. Imagine the outcry if a female lecturer was forced out of her job because she was talking to young women about womanhood. When feminists talk about male privilege in history, they should remember that men have uniquely been expected to fight and die for the country. So, there's a lot of areas that get overlooked, I think. But I think ultimately the battle of the sexes is a totally futile thing because both sides end up getting defensive. Women would resent, being seen as privileged. Men resent being seen as privileged. The truth is both men and women face challenges. Men face a lot of judgment. A guy who's struggling financially faces judgment just as much as women do for looks. And when we question why is it that so many men take their own lives? Could it be that the constant shaming is part of that? I think it is. Anyway, 30 minutes, I better wrap this one up. But if you're a guy, every situation is different. I mentioned the Iron Claw. That is quite a specific thing in the world of wrestling. But it's a great movie and it's worth checking out. It is sad. There are sad moments in that. It's a powerful film, but it's definitely a useful talking point, I think. And there is a more positive outcome to that. Kevin Von Erich has a large family. He has found something good has come out of something bad. Um, he has broken that cycle. Very strong man, Kevin Von Erich. But we have to get away from, as men, we have to get away from this ultra violent sort of approach to everything. And I'm not talking about sports like wrestling and boxing. I'm talking about everyday things, of the lack of respect and all this aggro, macho approach to everything. Now, there are times in self-defense and defending a more vulnerable person is absolutely necessary. I'm not a pacifist, but we need to get away from this toxic mindset of, particularly when it's alcohol combined with aggro and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Anyway, there's always more to say about the subject, but if you are struggling with depression, if you're a guy who's struggling with depression, um, just know that the time will seem dark, but there's always better times. I've been at points where I felt this is shit, it's not getting better, and yet somehow it always does. I'm not going to say that there will never be challenges, but just don't give up. Just don't give up. And for goodness sake, don't take that extreme measure, because you may think no one cares. You may think that it's your decision, but it's selfish, by the way. It is a selfish move, because I guarantee you will hurt someone if you do that. So please, for the love of God, don't do it. Seek help. Talk about the problems. If you have friends who aren't listening, then find new friends. Call the Samaritans in this country, 116-123. It's a free number. Someone will listen to you without judgment. Please, please, please do something. Even if it's just to step back a little bit, just do something. It will be okay. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.